Hello, and welcome to our podcast, Challenging Economic Assumptions. We're here to talk about economics. It's constantly being discussed by the media, by your dad, by your colleagues, throwing around ideas about what is good for the economy, what is bad for it, and how the hell we can make sure it continues to grow. Yet where have these ideas come from? In this series, we'll be unpacking some of the underlying ideas which underpin traditional economic thinking and discussing how we got here and what the impacts and repercussions of these assumptions have been on our societies and where we can go next. Our hosts, Gerry McCartney, Professor of Wellbeing Economics at Glasgow University, and Carmel Williams, Associate Professor from the Centre for Health and All Policies Research Translation, will be talking with various thinkers, activists, and economists who have focused their efforts on understanding these assumptions and how they have shaped the way we live. Today we'll hear from Matthias Schmelzer, an economic historian, social theorist, and climate activist. He is a post-doctoral researcher at the Friedrich-Schiller University Jena and is active in numerous social-ecological networks. He is also the author of 2 books, The Hegemony of Growth, the OECD, and the Making of the Economic Growth Paradigm, as well as, and most recently published, The Future is Degrowth, A World Beyond Capitalism, both of which touch on the history and idea of economic growth, which they'll be discussing in today's episode. We hope you enjoy.
Hello, so welcome to this edition of the podcast, and a huge welcome to Matthias Schmelzer, who is joining us from Germany today. Hi Matthias, how are you?
Hello, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me here.
It's great to have you, Matthias. We're really looking forward to today's conversation.
So Matthias, we are interested in the assumptions that underpin current dominant economic thinking. And you've written some really brilliant work around the concept of degrowth, but you've also investigated, I guess, a lot of the critiques of growth in your earlier work. So we'd be really interested just to hear about some of that work today. And I guess maybe could you start by just telling us some of your work, particularly how you got into this whole area and what your early work in this regard was?
Sure. So yes, as you said, the economic assumption that I've been mostly focusing on is basically focusing on the idea of growth, what I describe as or analyze as the growth paradigm, which is, I think, one of those assumptions that are very much taken for granted basically across the entire political spectrum. And I've come across this idea firstly from related to my activist work around climate issues, where in the mid-2000s there were a lot of debates around the potential incompatibility between economic growth and sustainability. And the other route to this topic was basically through my historical academic work.
Okay.
I was actually working in the archive of the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, focusing on issues around financial liberalization. And doing the archival work, I stumbled upon some very striking documents from the early 1960s, which made very clear that in that period, so some 50 years, 60 years ago, there were some very intense, deliberate efforts to make economic growth into a goal of policymaking.
Okay.
So I figured this is really interesting, that there was an historical period where apparently economic growth was not a goal of politics, policymaking, and there were some very deliberate efforts to make growth into this goal. So then I decided basically to refocus my historical work and wrote a book on the hegemony of growth, basically asking the question how the idea of economic growth became hegemonic in our societies, and basically uncarving this quite recent idea in its historical genesis.
That's fascinating, Matthias. So this kind of idea of growth being a hegemony or a sort of all-pervasive sort of way of thinking, why did the OECD change its approach? What were the arguments given at the time to try and prioritise that as an object or an ambition?
So basically, if we zoom out a bit, obviously since the emergence of, or if we zoom out very much throughout all of history, there has basically even economic growth as a phenomenon is a quite recent occurrence. It only started in the context of the industrial revolution and the emergence of capitalism in the 18th century, when we have when we started to have continuous per capita growth rates that were above a very, very minimal level. And since then, obviously, there have been some ways of theorizing, of thinking about this phenomenon, but they were not framed in the terms of economic growth for various reasons. The most important being that there were no conception of what is actually the economy as this totalizing entity comprising all the things that we now think very naturally as being the economy.
Yes.
And this conception only emerged in the 1930s to 1950s, when in the context of the emergence of interventionist state planning policies as a reaction to the Great Depression, mainly in this context, so the emergence of Keynesianism and interventionist politics, but also efforts to steer the economy in politically deliberate ways, in particular in the context of the war economy in the UK and the US during the Second World War. There were efforts to basically measure all economic activities, and these resulted in the international standardization of what today we know as gross domestic product, so GDP. Yeah. And these statistics very much laid the ground for the emergence then of the growth paradigm later on. They measure basically all the goods and services, the price of every goods and services produced within a given period in a certain region. And in this conception, you could conceptualize economic growth as basically the speed, the increasing speed of money changing hands. And this then gave rise to a whole wave of new ways of conceptualizing cornucopian visions, where there were no limits to growth, because growth was no longer directly linked or conceived as a material economy, but rather as this very monetary economy. And then in that context, this really laid the ground for then the emergence of the growth paradigm in the 1950s and 1960s, which were in that period, looking at the OECD, very much related to Cold War competition, a huge issue. So it's quite interesting to see that the growth paradigm became hegemonic not just in the West, in the capitalist West, but at the same time in a slightly different variant also in the Soviet Union, where there were all these 5-year plans, 10-year plans, big growth plans. And Khrushchev actually said in the late 1950s that economic growth is the battering ram with which we, the Soviet Union, will smash the capitalist system. So this then led to a lot of fear, actually a very sincere fear among experts in Western countries that they were losing out in the growth game. So this was one of the main reasons for then focusing on growth. The other was the context of imperial decline and decolonization, in which Western countries sought out ways to reshape the global order along the way, or in the framework of the development paradigm, which is very much linked to the growth paradigm, where development is conceived as this linear path, where basically the United States is the tip of where every other country could be aligned on this linear path, and GDP is the main measure. Economic growth is the main instrument of development in that conception.
And Matthias, over time, what has counted as economic activity and counted in these statistics has changed, hasn't it? So in the past there was debates around earned income, so the income you get through wages, and unearned income, so the income you get through rents. There was even different conceptions of what is the real source of value. Was value simply about agricultural production? Was it about the amount of labour, the amount of work that people put in to produce goods and services? Or is it about prices? Now, clearly that perspective gives you very different numbers. So some of those perspectives, for example, don't count domestic labour, so the work we do in our own houses, the caring duties we might take. So what does that mean then for how the measurement of GDP has changed over time?
Yeah. So this is another really fascinating question related to basically what is the economy, what do we want to measure, and then also what is growing if we talk about economic growth. And I think the main questions were basically settled with the international standardization of GDP statistics in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And it's quite interesting to see that since then there have continuously been very controversial debates around how GDP mismeasures our lives. To quote a recent report by Joe Stiglitz, Amartya Sen, and Jean-Paul Fitoussi for the French government. And these discussions have been very, very intense since the 1970s. Basically, economists knew and have known and have worked on this problem that economic growth is not a very good measure for welfare and for all the things that often are associated with GDP and growth. And interestingly, these controversies range back to the period when these numbers were actually made. So in the 1940s, there were also intense discussions around these questions, mainly concentrating on the question of whether to integrate reproductive activities, housework, and subsistence. Subsistence in particular regarding countries in the global south. There were discussions around inequalities and how to display inequalities within these statistics. And there were some early controversies around how to include what today we often discuss as nature or ecology, and whether to include material aspects in how we measure the economy. And it's interesting to see that in the 1940s, or up until the 1940s, there were early measures to create national statistics in various countries that did actually use, in some instances, did include non-monetary housework in these statistics. There were other conceptions that very much focused on material flows that were used in national statistical offices in Scandinavian countries, for example. And what we then see is a particular version of measuring the economy through specific mechanisms became the dominant one, became standardized throughout all countries internationally, very much related to particular levers through international organizations and aid work in the context of the Marshall Plan in Europe, but also then development aid more globally. Yeah. International organizations were used to standardize these statistics, to make this a level playing field in which supposedly everyone can use or can enter the game, the competition, along the same rules.
So it's really interesting, as I'm listening to you, Matthias, and not being an expert in this field, but having a bit of a background in policy and politics, it sounds like there's been a very strong relationship and interconnection between political, the role of politics in decision making and the use of economics to sort of further political gains. And that continues today, I guess. And so that makes me question then the reliability and validity of these measures, which is what you're challenging, the validity of gross domestic product as a true measure. But I guess how can we kind of shift this paradigm so that it is more accurately going back to some of those concepts and conversations and measures that were used in the 1940s and 30s?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good, good point. So I think I want to start with basically the strong link that you mentioned between economics and politics. And in the book, The Hegemony of Growth, I make the argument that there is this mutual relationship, the reinforcing relationship between the rise of the growth paradigm and the emergence of economics as the leading science that is shaping politics. And this goes in both ways. On the one hand, economists became a very powerful profession because through the emergence of the growth paradigm, they could claim to master the tools that were necessary to make growth happen. Yeah. Obviously, this gave them a very strong stance in political circles and arguably made economics into the leading social science, at least in terms of shaping politics. Since basically the Fordist era in the middle of the 20th century. But it also was the other way around. Because there was this rising dominance of economists, more economists were in powerful government advisory positions, etc. This obviously strengthened the use of growth statistics and the growth paradigm. And there has been this entire discussion about the superiority of economics. So a paper by Marion Foucault, basically dealing with the question why this particular science, this particular academic discipline became so dominant. And I think to actually understand how this came about, we need to look at growth and the growth idea. And obviously since the 1970s, this has shifted a bit, and we have this entire rise of neoliberal economics that has become dominant, which is then related in different ways to the growth paradigm, where the liberalization of markets is the main tool that is propagated to actually deliver in terms of growth. And on the question of what to do, so since the 1970s, as I mentioned a bit earlier, there have been these intense efforts to work on alternative indicators and other statistics to sit along or possibly replace GDP. So within international organizations such as the OECD, but also the United Nations, in many government circles, etc., there have been commissions, reports, many studies. Feminist economics has played a key role in this, of criticizing GDP and developing alternative indicators, such as the Human Development Index, the OECD Better Life Index, that is one of the most recent ones, etc., etc. And analyzing these efforts historically gives a very sobering, I think, analysis of these efforts, because they've been going on for such a long time with very little effect on actually challenging the growth paradigm as such. And I think there are particular reasons for this. That's why I think alternative statistics are probably a very necessary condition for changing politics towards a more sensible economic model that doesn't mainly prioritize growth but focuses on sustainability and well-being. But it's not a sufficient condition. There are other things that need to happen, because GDP statistics have not just become dominant in capitalist economies because of economists making these in a particular way, or certain political movements, etc., but because there's a very intimate fit between these types of economic statistics, measuring basically the amount of accumulation happening, and capitalism. So there are structural reasons why these statistics are very useful in capitalism. If GDP is rising, it's a very good indicator for example, for investors, that there will be average positive rates of return on these investments. etc., etc. So it's not just a coincidence how these statistics have become shaped, but there are very structural reasons for these.
Yeah, yeah. Matthias, I read your book, or the book that you contributed to, called The Future is Degrowth, A Guide to a World Beyond Capitalism. And in chapter 3, there's a table where you offer 6 or 7 different critiques of economic growth as a measure, and I found this really compelling. So you argued that there was an ecological critique because it destroys, economic destroys the ecological foundations of human life. There's a socio-economic critique, which is around inequalities. There's a cultural critique, which is about alienation and divorcing people from ways of working and living in relations. There's a critique about capitalism, which is in relation to processes of exploitation and accumulation. There's a feminist critique, which you've touched upon already. There's a critique in relation to industrialism, which is about undemocratic productive forces. And then there's a north-south critique, which is about sort of colonialism and extraction. Given all of these critiques, is that what's led you to think more deeply now around this concept of degrowth? And if so, could you maybe explain what you mean by degrowth in this context?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So basically, after I've then started to work on the hegemony of growth and thinking about how this particular conception, the growth paradigm, and maybe just to start off with what I mean by that. So it's basically the idea that economic growth is good,
Mm-hmm.
is necessary, is desirable,
Mm-hmm.
and it can be going on forever if the right political choices are made, like if we do sustainability politics. And it's also the idea that economic growth is basically the same as, or at least a necessary condition for achieving some of those goals that societies hold anyways, such as progress, development, power, national grandeur, etc., etc. And after focusing on this, or in the context of focusing on the question whether actually growth could deliver on all these promises that are then inherent in the growth paradigm,
Mm-hmm.
obviously in the current context, one of the key issues that come up is the question of sustainability,
Mm-hmm.
whether there are not really any limits to economic growth. So I then started to look into this, and there's very strong evidence suggesting that there is indeed a contradiction that cannot easily be resolved, at least in the longer term, between continued economic growth in particular for the early industrialized countries, the rich global north countries, and sustainability. Both cannot be achieved at the same time.
Is this sort of similar to the work by the Club of Rome and the limits to growth?
I mean, basically these arguments obviously started in the 1970s with the rise of the ecological movement, the modern Western ecological movement. Obviously, there have been other ones going on at the same time, with this particular focus on the limits to growth.
Yeah.
However, while the limits of growth mainly focused on resource constraints, so the question whether there are enough resources, enough land, enough energy, enough raw materials for continued economic growth. In the current context, there has been, in addition, another major concern that is about not where resources are coming from, so the inflows in the economy, but the outflows. So where is whether there are enough sinks. So it's mainly around, obviously, then CO2 emissions and climate change, the climate crisis. And yeah, there has been a very, very strong current of natural science, physics, and ecological economic studies dealing with the question whether economic growth can be decoupled from emissions fast enough. And to my knowledge, they quite conclusively show that at least if we take some very more strict environmental boundary conceptions, such as reaching staying considerably below the 2% degree limit agreed to in Paris, this will very likely not be achieved if global north countries continue with economic growth rates positive economic growth rates over the next decades.
Mm.
So this is and this is related to a whole field of ecological critiques of economic growth. But then I was wondering whether there are not other critiques of economic growth, which then led to this whole conceptualization of the 7 types of critiques of growth that form the basis of what we conceive of as degrowth.
Okay.
Degrowth is basically 2 things. On the one hand, it's a critique of the hegemony of growth, and on the other hand, it's a proposal for a radical change, a democratic transformation of global north societies that reduce the size of the economy in order to take off ecological pressure, while at the same time achieving or trying to achieve more equality and a good life for all. This opens up a whole new, obviously, research field. It's a big, since 20 years, it's been a new transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary research field where people from many disciplines try to work on many of the complicated questions around this, whether this can be done, whether the hypothesis that it is actually possible to live well with a much smaller ecological throughput, how to achieve this, what policies can lead to this, etc., etc. And then this is basically what we argue for in the degrowth context, and try to research from various angles.
So I find that fascinating, Matthias, but I guess a lot of people won't necessarily understand what aspects of economic activity the degrowth argument is sort of calling to be, managed in terms of decline, and which aspects would increase, because as you really articulated clearly already, GDP is a mishmash of all sorts of different things, and some things that are really important aren't counted. So I'm guessing that some aspects of society we would want to continue to grow. I'm thinking of social relationships and care. But you also mentioned that you sort of confined your argument to a degree to the global north, to sort of higher income countries. So could you maybe try and differentiate about which aspects of society in a degrowth paradigm we would look to decline and which aspects we would look to increase? And in particular, we might go on to talk about, for those aspects of decline, how do we protect people's livelihoods and protect against poverty and inequality in that context?
Sure. Maybe it's good to basically start with the problem of growth and the GDP statistics, because a lot of this relates to basically the false assumption that if GDP increases, this is actually good for everyone.
Yeah.
This is not the case, this is basically due to the fact that GDP measures all types of monetary transactions that are happening. And monetary transactions aren't really related directly to well-being. There's some major problems. So, for example, as I said earlier, that's the main line of argument from the feminist economics and the feminist critique. All the activities, the care activities that are essential to flourishing of human societies aren't really included in these statistics at all. So we can't measure all the care work that is going into reproducing our populations, the child caring, taking care of the elders, etc., etc. All these essential activities that are really crucial to human societies aren't included. Another aspect that is not measured, that is not taken into account, is the entire question of the ecological damages that are part of the process of economic growth since industrialization, which leads to the fact that in some instances, ecological damages, and obviously this has been discussed a lot, ecological damages can actually lead to rising GDP. So, for example, there's studies on the effects of certain oil spills that are then causing, obviously, a lot of labor that needs to go into cleaning up cleaning up all the damages, which then will lead to rising GDP. There's every car accident will be a positive contribution to GDP. There's more people going to hospitals, more new cars need to be built, etc. All this contributes to economic activity. And these more colloquial examples really do add up. And there are studies that show that both based on objective indicators of the objective circumstances of life, but also subjective indicators, basically asking how well people feel, that show that while there was until the 1970s in industrialized countries, well-being increased more or less in line with rising GDP. But then there was this huge decoupling where GDP continued to increase while prosperity tended to stagnate and then even started to decline in some countries. And I think this opens up a space for conceptualizing prosperity beyond growth. This is basically the foundation why, from a degrowth perspective, we can make the claim that yes, it is possible to actually increase human well-being while decreasing economic growth. And then I can also say something about the more specifics of what this actually means in terms of providing for the well-being of people, because obviously this is complex. So it's not the argument that everything needs to decline, as you said, but rather that those sectors and economic activities that cannot be made sustainable in the short term and that mainly serve the consumption of the really well-off, and are really unsustainable, such as private jets. And we could start with these, but then also this really boils down to other things. They should decline. At the same time, we need to increase other economic activities. So a main proposal is around the decommodification and expansion of essential public services, from healthcare to education, housing, public transit, clean energy, water, internet, nutritious food, etc., to actually provide these as a social right that everyone should have access to, as a fundamental basis to actually de-link our well-being from wages and thus from economic growth.
So what I was going to say, Matthias, was when you were describing how the economic growth and well-being has been decoupled, that kind of mirrors what we in the health system have known for a while, that and we use income, I guess, in measuring people's economic status often as an indicator. But certainly, as your income goes, from very low rates and it increases, your health will increase. But it reaches a plateau where it doesn't really matter how much more money you earn, that your health never gets better. And actually, at some points, it starts to dip. So the idea that more money, more wealth is good for your health is a fallacy. And so I think, at an individual level, I'm talking about an individual level and on population scales, but you're talking about this as global phenomenon. But I think there's parallels there which are interesting and reinforce each other in some ways.
Definitely. I mean, just look at the United States health sector, which is really the most expensive health system in the world by far. But the health outcomes are really, really miserable. They are, and you see this huge mismatch. So the question then becomes, what are effective ways of translating economic activities into well-being? And the privatized health system in the United States is a really ineffective provisioning system. That's what it's called in the field of ecological economics, where basically the provisioning system, the question is how the provisioning systems are actually designed. And there are many ways to design provisioning systems in a way that much smaller inputs of energy and materials lead to better outcomes. And the ways these have to be designed is very often you take out you take out certain forms of competition that lead to irrational outcomes, status, consumption, etc., etc. You take out in very unequal systems of provisioning, and you bring in certain universally accepted standards. That's why, in the context of degrowth and post-growth economics, one conception that has become quite popular is to talk about consumption corridors. So it's providing a certain threshold from below, but at the same time also limiting consumption levels, but this can also be translated into income levels, wealth levels from above. To have a certain threshold within which then human societies can actually flourish without these being ripped apart by overconsumption, overproduction, as is currently the case.
Matthias, you've sketched out, I think, a really clear difference between a degrowth perspective of society and an austerity perspective of society. And some people do conflate these because they see, oh, it's a decline in economic growth or economic activity. But am I right in saying that your differential here is that in a degrowth situation, you would envisage public services being strengthened, there's sort of being communal luxury, if you like, so the provision of public services so that everybody has what they need, but a decline in private luxury, so moving towards sort of private sufficiency sort of approaches, so this corridor of safe consumption. And that's very different from an austerity perspective, which usually means disinvestment in public services, privatisation, and as such, people either drop into poverty and consumption levels that are too low, or they, if they're richer, they would buy it privately, and so, you know, it exacerbates inequalities in society. Is that a fair characterisation of the difference between an austerity and a degrowth approach?
Definitely. And this is a very, very, very important point. Very often, and I understand why, people do misunderstand degrowth as basically translating into a politics of less that is mainly focusing on austerity, on arguing that working class people, like the normal population, should reduce their consumption flat out and basically live with less. And obviously for many people, even in the global north countries, that is not really even possible. Many people who are struggling to get along. But this is a huge misconception of what degrowth is actually trying to achieve. There's one slogan from the early décroissance movement, so the French movement where this actually started in southern France in the early 2000s, that is saying, leur récession n'est pas notre décroissance. So their recession is not our degrowth. So there's a clear distinction that is being made between recession in the context of capitalist growth-dependent economies and the desirable democratic form of degrowth that we are promoting. And there's many levels on why this difference is so important, but I think what the key issue here is actually that post-growth discussions very much focus on, and in my analysis also need to focus even more on the question of growth dependencies. So there are certain growth imperatives that are structurally embedded in our economic system, but also in our social systems. In many of our social systems, we do actually live in a growth economy and a growth society. And in that context, the absence of economic growth often is a social disaster. So capitalist recessions in the context of growth-dependent institutions is really leading to social deprivation, rising unemployment rates, and this negative feedback spiral where it's very difficult also to get out. So one can conceive of capitalism as being this very fragile system that needs to constantly expand in order to be stable. And one needs to take this very seriously. So without transforming these growth-dependent structures and institutions, post-growth is very unlikely to be a desirable option. So it's there needs to be a real focus on and a reconceptualization of what are actually these growth-dependent institutions and structures, and how can we change them. And there's a lot of research going into this, focusing on how to transform, for example, the social system, the social welfare state, which is at the moment fundamentally growth-dependent, into one that could actually be sustained beyond rising national income, etc., etc. So we need to differentiate the two, recession and degrowth, and this is one of the main misconceptions. There are many other ones that are quite similar to this. Many people think degrowth is against technology, it's about going back to the caves, which is a total misconception of what we are advocating for. Degrowth is very much for the use of technologies, but against relying on technological improvements as the main fix to solve societal problems, which is a very unrealistic belief and a very, in the negative sense, a very utopian project that won't deliver. Others are arguing that degrowth is basically saying that the global south should stay poor because there's no room for growth anymore. Also, this is a gross misconception. So it's a complicated debate, I guess.
Sorry, I just was going to ask Gerry. Sorry, I was going to ask about. So these arguments that are being put forward to weaken the concept or to challenge the concept of degrowth, where are they coming from? Where are these voices coming from? Are they from, the usual suspects? Economists embedded in the kind of mainstream economic process, political parties and political discourse. So where are they coming from? Who really are the adversaries that we need to be understanding and thinking about in this space?
I mean, this has become a quite big debate over the last years. In particular, because post-growth, the case for post-growth is becoming stronger. The need for demand-side measures, so the reduction of overall demand, is even now a major point in the IPCC. So there's more and more arguments for the need of politics along the lines of post-growth and degrowth. And in that context, obviously, the counter-arguments have become stronger and stronger. And they come from many, many different angles. So firstly, they come basically from those advocating for green growth or Green New Deals, or the Green Deal in the European Commission context. They do also come, obviously, from those who are negating, denying, or delaying all ecological crises and climate crisis. But they also come from the left. And this relates to the traditional conception on the left being a very productivist conception of societal developments, in which the development of productive forces, so of the technologies and the technological institutions that are developed within capitalism, then in that conception provide the basis for the emancipation of society and the liberation of people from the need to work. And this is a very powerful narrative that still today, I think, shapes parts of progressive discussions, which becomes problematic in the context of the imperial mode of living and the current overuse of natural space. And in that context, I think we need a fundamental reconceptualization of what actually are the relations between capitalism and the productive forces, in which productive forces as in and of themselves can become a very destructive development that needs to also be transformed in any way, in any emancipatory societal transformation. This is mainly the argument coming from what we call the industrial critique of economic growth, where basically the argument is there can socialism or progressive projects that mainly rely on using the same technologies developed within capitalism will not be able to be sustainable if they rely on this growth paradigm and the conception of basically solving fundamental democratic and social conflicts through expansion, rather than by moving towards some real autonomy in which the setting of collective limits is actually a key part of what democracy is about.
Matthias, that is fascinating, and thank you so much for spending time with us today and talking through this. I think we've discussed in detail one of the key assumptions, but often one of the most hidden assumptions within the current economic paradigm, which is around economic growth and how that's hegemonic and sort of all-pervasive in all of the economic models and economic discussions we've seen. And I think you've brought to our listeners a number of critiques, 7 different critiques around that, and articulated how we might think about economic growth differently and economic systems differently. So I'm very, very grateful to your time. So it's a huge thanks from us. Carmel, thank you. Good to see you again. And join us again for the next episode of the Economic Assumptions podcast. Thanks, Matthias.
Yeah, thanks, Gerry. Thanks, Carmel, for having me.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
And that's it for today's episode of Challenging Economic Assumptions. Don't forget to follow us on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts, and please share with anyone you think will be interested in this discussion. Thank you so much for listening.